ballroom. So next one we have up is a good one. This is Trenton Ivey. He does offensive research and development for SecureWorks. He has been voted to the all-star squad of the red team, what, 6, 7 years running now?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. All right, please welcome Trenton Ivey.
Thank you, guys. I'm really excited to be here. This is my first time at ShowMeCon, and I'm absolutely loving it. I was not sure what I was going to get into when I showed up here, and like the Vindir area and the conference and the size and the energy has just been a whole lot of fun. So thank you guys for making this an awesome con and letting me be part of it. Before we start, just to get an idea of who I'm talking to, how many people would say that they're on the offensive side of the house when it comes to security? Okay, so a couple hands, not very many. How many people are on the defensive side? How many people are in the wrong conference? One guy. Okay, cool. So it seems like we're primarily a defensive audience here, which is good. This is an offensive talk. But as I go through, there's actually a whole lot of defensive applications. And so please keep defense in your mind as you're watching a talk that's primarily about how we're leveraging things from an offensive side. So my name is Trenton Ivey. I am with SecureWorks. I am their offensive research and developer. We have a whole ton of defensive research and development. But last year we decided we need to really focus on purely development from an offensive standpoint. How can we make hacking tools better so that we can learn off of that and we can be ahead of the curve? So I actually get to be in a really cool spot. I'm on our adversary group, which is where our red team is lies. I'm also on our counter threat unit. So I have two different bosses. One is to try to hack things as best as possible, and one of them is try to stop hacking. So it's been fun to watch those two collaborate. From my background, my degree in biology and chemistry, which surprisingly has a lot more to do with security than you would actually imagine. I would have never imagined myself in a pen test role when I finished with my degree, and yet I find myself leveraging what I've learned in chemistry and bio quite often. I've done everything from healthcare to the QSA, PA QSA, if you want to boo, sorry, I was that guy for a while. I led a network penetration testing team for a Fortune 500 company, so I got to see the inside of the house kind of testing, and really got to learn how to build a program from the inside up and how pen testing works from a long-term perspective. Now I'm back more in the consultative role where I get to come in and help clients improve their own program. So today I'm going to be talking about a couple of things. First, what I mean by offensive cartography and why I think it matters. In short, I'm going to be talking about how we can store data as well as visualize data as it relates to our operational environment or what we're doing during an engagement. What's really cool for those defensive people is we are looking at the exact same thing, but just from a different side of the story. We're looking at how can we attack. If you're on the blue team doing IR type of work, really you're asking the same questions, but just in reverse. How did they attack? And so a lot of the graphs and the models and the things that I'm going to be discussing hopefully will be just as applicable. So we'll go over why I think it's important. This is not a new idea. I'm not coming up with anything new or revolutionary. Graph theory has been around for a very, very long time. There are a ton of security tools that already do a really good job of leveraging some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about. So I want to go through some of the tools that we have in our toolkit that do this well today. One of the things that we found as we start to look at modeling an environment is it's really easy to start asking the questions that you want to have answered before you start modeling the environment. And that's good, and that makes very efficient tools. But we've looked at trying to flip that on its head and say, how can we model the environment as accurately as possible and then ask questions of it? So we're trying to do a little bit, take it from a different perspective, and so I want to show what that looks like. And then I want to just spend a couple minutes talking about how we can go from here next. More of a call to arms on, I think we need to do this more, and explain exactly why and how. So for the what and why, I'm going to start really high level, but in graph theory you have this idea of nodes and edges. So for your environment, think of the different assets or resources that you have in your environment. Think of nodes as things like maybe systems. You might have users in that environment, so people could be considered as a resource to some extent. You might have data. Anything in your environment that you are responsible for maintaining or protecting, consider as a resource. And as we look at this, there's really a series of actions that you can use to connect between resources, right? So you have your resources. All these are related, and you can try to define those relationships between each other. And then really, as an attacker, our job is to figure out, we know these relationships between these different data points. How can we get from one spot to the next? How can we get from one system to the next? How can we take a user's credential and use that to get onto another system? And really, it's moving from point A to point B, where point B is our objective. And of course, as you compromise an environment, you can open up new paths and create new data points for you to leverage. And so it's really a very back and forth interaction with your environment. As you exploit, you get more data, you leverage that data to then exploit more, and you continue on and continue on. And it's very iterative. I love this quote. It's from John Lambert of the Microsoft Intelligence Threat Center, or I'm sorry, Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. Defenders think in a list, attacker thinks in graphs. As long as this is true, attackers win. I wish I could say that I got that quote from John, but I didn't. I actually stole it from a DEF CON talk from the creators of Bloodhound AD, which is a tool I'll be talking about. I absolutely love the tool. It's very cool. They're the furthest ahead in this theory that I've seen, at least, from the offensive side. But reason number one, I think that we need to start using graphs and data visualization to model our environments is because attackers operate in graphs. Really, the job of a pen tester is not just to know which tools to use. I know a lot of people that are very, very good at knowing which tool to use in what scenario, and they just do a mediocre job at pen testing. What really makes the attackers stand out is not how they know to use the tools, but how they know to relate the data between the tools. So output from one tool is useful in this context because it can apply to this other tool or action that I want to perform. So attackers operate in graphs, and I really want to try to find ways to help defenders think in graphs as well. So I want to model what we do in that way to not only improve us, but then to help improve defensive. So, on to reason number two. Quick picture time. I'm going to show some images. I want you to think about what you're going to see here. All right, so, picture number one. Picture number two. Picture number three. Number four. And number five. Right? So what do those pictures have in common? Anybody? Yeah, patterns, right? Like, none of those objects were actually what you probably saw, at least at first, right? You see an orange that looks like a person. You see a back of a chair that looks like a face. So we are really, really good at recognizing patterns. Our minds have evolved to recognize patterns. We live in an environment when there's subtle differences between two plants, and if you get the wrong one, it's going to kill you. And so there's some selection there, right? We want to determine patterns. We've got a lot of machinery in our head to recognize and identify patterns. And what we find is that many of the tools that we leverage from day to day spits out a whole bunch of data at you, and it doesn't really do a good job of explaining where those patterns lie and how you can identify them and connect them. So leveraging our mind's ability to recognize patterns, I think, is really useful and helps out a lot. If you didn't see this already, here's another example. Those letters were switched. The words are all spelled wrong, but your mind probably just intuitively fixed it because of that whole pattern recognition thing, right? Does anybody know what this is? Nobody. All right. This is memory sport. It's like my type of sport. I have a terrible memory, but if I were to be in sports, it would be memory sport. These guys, this is one of the world championships. These guys, it's not a very good spectator sport because it's like a room like this, but everybody's just like looking at a book for like a half hour. But the idea is to memorize like super long numbers or names and faces or text. They do all these crazy feats of memory and compete against each other to see who can memorize things the best. So we're going to do an experiment here really quick. I'm going to have you guys memorize something. I'm going to show you a list of words. There's 10 words. I want you to remember them in order. You're going to have 45 seconds to memorize these starting now. No cameras either. All right, time's up. Anybody want to come up here and miss them off? Anybody? We got somebody who thinks they can do it. All right, let's see. While he's coming up, how many people think that they actually have it? You don't have to come up because that's intimidating, but how many people think they have it that didn't take a picture? You got like 2 or 3 hands. Okay, cool. Stand in front of my laptop here.
Do I have to do them in order?
Yes.
No!
Okay, well, if you can't do them in order, that's all right.
Okay.
Try, but let's see how you do.
Yarn, basket, robot, book, belt, toothpick, orange, pen, nail polish, glitter.
All right, wow. All right, okay. So before you go really quick, do you have a method to remember those?
Yes.
What's your method?
I put them together in a story.
Okay, go sit down. So, this guy. There's a Greek poet that was, the story goes, he's at this banquet, there's this big party, And he's doing what the Greeks do back in that time. They tell stories and sing songs and whatnot. And apparently 2 guys come to get him. He's told, like, there's 2 guys out waiting outside, so, like, take a break, go talk to these guys. He walks out of this big building, this palace, and the whole thing collapses, and the 2 guys are gone. And so he, like, looks back, and all his family, friend, everybody he knows is dead. And it was such a bad collapse that they couldn't identify anybody that was in the building. Like, it was just complete rubble. And so they were trying to identify, like, who died, and who do we need to, like, let them know that, like, hey, your family's died. So they came up to this poet, and they said, do you remember who was there? And he kind of was trying to think about it at first, and then he started visualizing where people were at specific spots in the room. And as he closed his eyes and thought where people were in the room, all of a sudden he could go through every single person in the party that he knew, and came up with this list. And so out of this became a whole school of memorization that they get applied and taught. Cicero was one of the earlier proponents of it. And it's what they actually still use today in memory sport. The guys that memorize pi out to like 65,000 digits are using the same technique. And so the way that it works is you have a list of objects, and instead of just trying to remember the objects, you picture a path that you walk often. So maybe from the front door of your office up to your desk, or from the front door of your house to your room. Some common path that you're very familiar with and you can visualize. Next, you take the objects and you mentally take the object and stick it along the path as you go. Right? So it sounds like the one person in the room that was able to recite them all actually is already doing this. Right? So I want to repeat the exercise, but let's do it with the mental path. Right? Just to make a case. We've got 45 seconds. Let's start again going now. All right, time's up. I'm not going to have anybody else come up again, but just out of curiosity, how many people think that they actually have the list this time using the new technique? A few more hands, not as many as I thought, but here they are. You can look at it really quick and see if you could have got them again. So I think reason number 3 of why I think we need to start thinking in graphs is because we have a very good spatial memory. Actually, they've done brain scans of some of the world's best memorizers, and find that they're actually activating the part of their mind that's responsible for spatial memory versus rote memory. So next, has anybody seen this before? This is Mar.io by Seth Bling. It's a really cool project, and he's basically taking a neural network. On the left, you have the input of what the AI can see of the game. So like white is this is okay to stand on, the black is like it'll kill you. And he runs it through training, and like he has the whole video of like watching the different iterations. On the left, you see the input. In the middle, you have the neural network. At first, Mario is like crashing into stuff and dying constantly, but you just try it and try it and try it and try it, and you tell Mario you get more points the better you do. On the right, you can see the output of what AI is actually pushing on the controller, right? And so just running through AI, this is actually like AI beating Mario. It's not a human playing, but it's playing as good or better than I could play. The thing that I want to call out about this is you hear a lot about AI and using it in intelligence. Really, AI is very good about pulling out the relationships between data points, right? You have data point on the left, input. You have data on the right, output. AI is good at identifying the edges and the relationships between those. And so I think one of the things that we often do in testing and when we're thinking about even defense is we get spreadsheets with huge lists of items, right? And it's very good at identifying the input or output data, but it does a really terrible job of identifying the relationships in between. And in some cases, AI can probably help solve that. I think probably an easier short-term solution and a little bit easier to implement up front is let's try to define it as best as we can using the AI that we have up here. I guess not AI, just I. Next, I think there are plenty of task runners. We've got a lot of tools that will execute tasks in a certain order. There's a lot less tools that look at the output of one and then go to the next. If you've looked at the Caldera tool by MITRE, they're trying to solve this by automating some tests. They look at the environment, they collect data, and then depending on the data that you have, it will take different actions to try to emulate a threat actor. So very, very neat project. We don't need more task runners that just simply run tasks in order. We need more tasks and run tasks relationally. And then reason number 6, I think graphs are just really fun to play with. It's just neat to have an interface where you can drag and drop things and see how they relate very naturally. So that is the why and what of what I'm calling offensive cartography. Like I said, this is not a new idea. This has been done before. So I'll run through a couple of tools. How many people have used Scapy or heard of Scapy before? Cool. So it's a packet manipulation library. It's in the back end of a bunch of tools. Very, very useful tool. But how many people knew that you could actually do data visualization within Scapy itself? Anybody? No hands. All right, cool. So this is a really neat function of Scapy. Here's a demo really quick. So I've got an array of some of the most common websites, and I'm going to feed that into the built-in traceroute function in Scapy. We're going to get the answers and then the unanswered responses. So there the packets go. And here's the output. Here's what we normally look at when we're doing tests, right? Here's all of your trace put output. Here's a bunch of data. Can you find relationships in that quickly? And probably the answer is no. So they have this handy graph function that I don't think very many people know about, right? You take your answers, you run it through the graph function, and it will output a diagram. So take a look at the list of IP addresses versus the relationship of the IP addresses. In a test, I run this, and now I have an awesome map of how the environment relates to itself, right? I'm up top, and I can look at all my different targets, see how they connect, see what data centers they might go through, see what they have in common, see what networks they belong to. Super useful. That whole thing took like 30 seconds, right? Trying to do that manually by looking at that list of traceroute information would never happen. I would never find those relationships and the nuance between how they relate, at least not without hours of trying to stare at it and map it out myself. So that's an awesome tool. How many people have heard of Maltego? A lot more people. So this is probably one that's used a lot more on the defensive side. It's more of an analyst tool. It's an awesome tool. Here's a quick demo of it. So I took ShowMeCon as the starting point. And we'll go ahead and run a query to get back the DNS names from it and the IP addresses from it. We can run a transform to see what it's built off of. Here's a bunch of objects that show, okay, this website was built with all of these different technologies. We can take one of the IP addresses and let's run who is on it. This will then output, that was first NetBlocks. We'll run who is next. And you can see it'll pull back who is information. So you can see it's Cloudflare running the ShowMeCon website. You can see contacts. In this case, it's kind of boring because it's not directly tied to ShowMeCon. But we can also go and spider the website very quickly and say what links might exist on this website. And so we'll pull back that, and we can see everything else that it relates to. So we'll go spider. There's the title. Spider next. You can see all these links that it finds on the page will then show up on the graph here. And we can even start over, right? We can pick one of those links and then begin the process again. So it's a great way to visualize how things relate if you're doing things like open source intelligence and trying to target, or profile a target. This is an excellent tool. One of the challenges we've had is that it's hard to interact back and forth with your environment. So if we're trying to see what's current state, it's very good at running transforms on data. It's a little bit harder to pull things in and out, but it's an excellent tool, especially for analysis of after the fact and defensive side. And I really love how it uses the visual aspect and the relationship aspect of edges and nodes. Bloodhound AD. Anybody heard of this? Absolutely love this tool. This is a lot of what inspired me to start looking at this and start acting on this. Side note, so Harmjoy, awesome dude, one of the creators of Bloodhound. We were at DerbyCon. He has a friend, I have a friend that was kind of mutual. And so I was working on a PowerShell remote access tool that was kind of custom that we were doing for client. They're like, we want you to do run a malware test, but you can't use malware that's ever been found before. We want you to create custom malware and see how we hold up against something that's never been seen. So I was building some malware, and one of the parts of it had some PowerShell in it. And so our mutual friend introduced us, but he didn't tell me his name or who he was. And so we're sitting at the bar, and I'm talking to him about it for a while, and like about 15 minutes in the conversation, I go, hey, have you ever heard of PowerShell Empire? It's a really cool tool. You should check it out. And he pulls out his laptop, and he's like, dude, I wrote it. So that was kind of embarrassing, humbling, but super awesome guy. And I love what they're doing with Bloodhound. It's got a really simple graph model on the back end. They've got a premise that makes it really easy to analyze data. The idea is that you're moving from lesser privileges to more privileges. And so you can connect a user that has certain group rights that may then have the ability to access a computer. And then you can look at that computer and see, okay, it has maybe a session. So there's a user on that you could compromise, use that session then to get access to another system or another user that might have rights like domain admin. So you can start to create these maps. So here's what it looks like visually. So this is just a list of all the different users that have domain admin. It's the default view when you get into the application. But you can do all sorts of really neat stuff with it. So we'll take a look at shortest path between certain entities. So you can see on the left, it's furthest away. On the right is actually what we're trying to get to. In this case, domain admin. They have a whole lot of pre-built queries, but we'll start with, you can actually start a starting point. So let's say we've compromised desktop 8, right? And that's where we actually ran the initial query from. So if you've compromised an environment, then I can say, I'm on this system. How do I get to where I want to go? And it will pull out the information from the graph and say, hey, you're on the system. It's got the ability to admin this system, which then has the ability to get access to this user, which has the domain admin. And so even though I might be a low privilege user, by understanding the connections between that user, groups, systems, and policy, you can go from a lower privilege user up to a higher privilege user. So this is an excellent way to answer a very specific question on how do I get from where I am to where I want to go in an environment. They've got pre-stored queries, so you can do a lot of really, really interesting things, like how many users, which users have the most sessions in your environment. So which user is on the most systems at any given time. Or you can ask the inverse, right, like which systems have the most users connected. As defense, that's super important, right? Like if you've got a bastion, you have a ton of users connecting to that. If that bastion gets compromised, now that attacker potentially has access to every user that's on that system. And so it can help you identify the bastions you've intentionally set up, but also the bastions that you might not have thought of, right? Things that people are often connecting to, file servers, for example, that might have a lot of sessions that aren't necessarily considered as a high-profile bastion. As a side note, you can do some fun stuff with the data. They have a nice user interface. I took the data. Again, this is the systems and how many users are connected to them at any given time, and threw it into a different view. The bigger circles, and this is just their default data, so it's not probably as exciting as it might be in your real-world environment. But the bigger circles are the systems that have the most users connected to them. And so if you put this in a report and show this to a client, they will get it. If you try to explain to them the nuances of how Active Directory work and why certain systems that have lots of users are important, it might be a little bit harder. And this is easy to quickly visualize, right? Throw the data in the graph, and you easily can see what you need to prioritize. Cobalt Strike. Has anybody played with or used this one? Yeah, so this is a cool tool. We've got this one in our toolkit. One of the things that I love about this is its ability to show the kill chain, right? So you start on the left, you compromise something. As you compromise systems and pivot to systems, systems will pop up, and as you compromise them, like little lightning bolts show. It's a cool way to visualize the kill chain throughout an environment, and it provides like a nice user interface to interact with your agents as they're on the system. So how are we doing on time? We are, okay. So one of the things that we kind of ran into when we were trying to look at how can we take this and run with it and make it better is a lot of the tools that are out there, for good reason, have decided to decide what their end goal is and then build the domain model for their graphs or build the visualizations around the question that they're searching for. So like if you look at Bloodhound, great tool. They're trying to figure out how do things relate on AD. But what we thought is, what if we could generalize things a little bit more, or take things and generalize them a little bit more? So we wanted to try to find a way to model the environment in enough of a way that we as attackers can then find the relationships between data types. You as defenders can take the exact same model and apply it retroactively, so that hopefully in the end state then, we can use the same model for various different tools and various different reasons. So it's much more complex. It's a lot harder to work with, and we're really just early in this phase, so I'm sure there's going to be a lot of lessons learned. This is more of where we're at and where we're wanting to go. So there's some things that we want to figure out. One is, what do we know, right? So one of the things that Cobalt Strike does really, really good with, but some of the other tools I mentioned might not do quite as well, is what's going on right now. I, as an operator in an engagement, don't want to spend a whole lot of time trying to like load data into a tool and then process that data and figure that data out. Really, I want whatever I'm interacting with to show me what I know right now as quickly as possible. So I want all the output from my tools to be consumed into one place as quickly as possible to give me a current view. One of the things that a lot of the other tools don't show, you can kind of do this with Maltego. There's probably other scanning tools that will do this to some extent, but it doesn't tie it together, doesn't glue it together very well, is what vulnerabilities can we exploit, right? If I've got a system as a node, a vulnerability should be a node, right? And I should be able to quickly look at how that might be a potential entry point along that path. One of the things that none of the tools really have an easy path for is credentials, right? You compromise credentials. Saw Sean's talk, right? He gets a bunch of hashes from Responder. You crack those now. You've got clear text credentials. How does that relate to the environment, right? One way is to abuse systems that you've already compromised and follow paths of privileges, but sometimes you try to find a path from point A to point B and it says it doesn't exist. And so then you have to try to figure out what credentials you have and how they can relate. If you can tie that together in your graph model, then you can actually do those searches and those queries from your model. Next, so again, I mentioned shortest path. There's some really cool things with graph theory. There's a couple of different algorithms you can use to find the shortest point between different nodes, and you can do some fun things like weighting the edges differently so that you get different results based off of how hard something might be to accomplish. But doing that, it makes it really easy to say, here's where I'm at, here's what I know, I want to get to here, give me the shortest path. The cool thing about this is by doing it programmatically versus up here in our head, which most pen testers do, is we can start to build automation around this. And so we can actually have tools follow decision trees for us and start to make our attacks quicker. I think the industry is going one of two ways. Well, I as an attacker have to go one of two ways to keep up with the industry. One is to be more stealthy, which we can do, but that takes a lot of time and investment. It's very, very possible, and it's a very good solution. I don't think we should stop looking for people that are going the stealthy route. I think probably the one that we'll see grow more in the next couple of years is people trying to move fast. We've had several clients where we got in, got 80, got what we wanted, and out within like a day. And the blue team comes back and says, but we caught you. Like, here's the logs. Like, we caught you. We got an alert. It's like, awesome. I'm so glad that you got that alert. Let's have a conversation on what we can do to prevent everything else that happened in the next hour or two. Because if I'm an attacker, I don't care whether you got an alert or not. All I care about is I got my objective complete. I've got your data, and it's out of your environment. And so I think moving faster is one of the things that we'll see people move towards. And humans can only think so fast. We can only relate data in complex environments so fast. And so by modeling it and building automation off around that, I think we're going to start seeing attacks happen much quicker and quicker and quicker as attackers move to more of a model that focuses on speed over stealth. The other one is what resources can my agents currently access, right? When you've got a lot of complex environments with a lot of different data types, you want to have a quick representation of what can I get to quickly from where I'm at. The other thing is we want to be able to ask really complex questions about our environment in a really short period of time. So, for example, let's say we want to find all users that have a compromised web application, with a compromised web application credential, that have a common email address with a known domain user account. Right? So that's a kind of a complex question, right? Like we know we've got credentials. We know for a user that's from an application. We know that user then shares a same email address with the domain account. So now we can start to say, okay, let's make some connections and try to use the same credential from the application against the domain. Right? And so now instead of trying to take every single credential that we found in this application and run it across every single user in the domain, which is what a lot of attackers do, and it's super noisy, we can now narrow down the list of credentials and users that we want to try when we're trying to attack the domain. So not only is that allowing us to move faster, but in this case, quieter. We can even make that question more complex. We can say, let's then take that to authenticate to all systems that are not joined to a domain that we know, that happen to have SMB or remote desktop enabled, and are visible from a system that currently has an agent, right? That's a complex question that normally would take a person a lot of time to figure out. That's the kind of thought process that we're going through as an attacker. And to be able to model that and show that in a platform, I think will help us a lot. So the plan that we have, and that I'm kind of running through, and like I said, we're still in early phases from the offensive side of this. I think we're further along on the defensive side, but our offensive side is quickly catching up, is really define the data points in our model, right? Figure out what is in the environment first. Don't try to ask the questions, but figure out what data point we're regularly leveraging. And then figure out how those things relate to one another. After that, let's build our graph model and consume information from our current tools. That's kind of where we're at right now. Purpose-built views, like within the last week and a half getting ready for this talk, I've started to try to pull a couple of things together just to proof of concept it. I think next is to enhance data with new tools, so building better things to go back and collect data quicker, quieter, as well as integrate command and control. Like my end goal, my vision is that we have a Maltego-esque platform in which I can right-click on a host and say, given my current agents, get here. And I can maybe say, like, this is how risky I want it to be, this is how loud I want to be, all of those parameters. And it will figure out the path and then ask if I want to execute a certain plan. I think we're a little ways away from that, but that's what we're working towards. So here's the graph model we have. It's a little bit small. I'll probably post this online. But you can see that it's kind of complex, right? It's a lot more complex than something like Bloodhound's model. Again, nothing against Bloodhound. Love Bloodhound. And it's way easier to work with than what this will end up being. But we've had several guys on the team spend a lot of hours trying to think of what we use and how this relates and ran it through various scenarios. And this is kind of what we've ended up with. It's complex. We have everything from like a host relating to an IP, to user accounts, to types of information like emails and service principal names, all of those things, and the connections, most importantly, the relationships between them. So here's an example of pulling some data using that model. This is only three of those data points on that model. I scanned a /24 in AWS. I just picked a random one and scanned it. Each of those kind of blobs is a host and an IP connection. You have the host so that you can then have things like dual home hosts where you have 2 IPs or more. And then the blue dots are services. So you can see that there's a whole lot of hosts there that don't actually have anything exposed, right? They came back as up, but they don't show anything exposed. So if we strip out all the hosts that don't have any services, and then we tie domain name information to it, this is what you get. You can see that they all share the common pointer record, like the Amazon default pointer record, and that center dot is the actual registered domain. So not subdomains for each host, but the registered domain. If we look at a different environment, here's another environment. It's a smaller environment, and you can see in this case, let's see if I can do this without breaking anything. Well, actually, I don't think we're recording, so I'll just use the later pointer. So down here, you can see that we've got one environment here, and this is a bunch of subdomains of a given domain. We've got another domain, a registered domain with a bunch of other subdomains, and we can see all the hosts that relate to them. And for each host, we can see which services are exposed. So that gives us a pretty good idea of an environment. And this is input from simply an nmap scan was the input for this. Everybody uses nmap, right? Nmap to this, and now all of a sudden you can see your environment much clearer than you might with just reading through a scan. Here's one of the cool things, though. As you start to add in more data points to your model, you can do some really cool things. So we have a database. We collect as many publicly available breaches as possible and index all of that. So I can take your domain name for your organization, and it will spit out every known compromised clear text password that we have. And there is a ton of stuff. Like go out to Have I Been Pwned. We don't have quite as big as a collection as they do, but pretty close. And most of them are in clear text. We have a big giant cracking rig, and we use a lot of its spare time to crack what we don't have. And so the really cool thing is we start a pen test, and before we even get out of the OSINT phase, we have credentials for a whole bunch of people in your organization. And it might be their personal accounts. We won't attack personal accounts as part of a corporate pen test, but a lot of people use the same credentials that they use in their personal life with their corporate life. Like almost every engagement, we can log in as a valid user before we even have to throw exploit code. So the cool thing about using this model, though, is now we can see, okay, we've got these 2 different users. They've got an email and a credential, and we can see that they are related to a domain. So I can now say, okay, this user has this credential. Let's follow it up to here. And now we can assume that any of the hosts that are connected to that domain likely might have that user and that password as something we should try. So now we can generate lists very quickly on the fly of which accounts should we try to compromise as we do our brute force attacks at the start of the engagement. So I think that's the power of not only having data, like here's a username and a password, but also being able to model the relationships between those. So where we want to go, right? I think one of the things we're trying to do is build purpose-built views, finding ways to view data better. What I was just showing you is output from Neo4j. It's a backend to Bloodhound AD. It's an awesome graph database. If you haven't played with graph databases, I highly recommend you spend some time looking at them. They're a lot of fun. They're pretty easy to pick up. So a couple of views, for example, like as we started looking at what we wanted to see, when we're trying to attack an environment, we want to have a very different view than when we're trying to laterally move across that environment. One is what's exposed. Next is how do the things on the inside relate. And so we're trying to build different views for those. There will probably be several more. Next, like I said, enhance data and integrate command and control into the environment. Remembering this model, right, we've got the hosts and the domains. I took the exact same input and put it into a custom view that was like really preliminary of our attack view. Removed IPs just for confidentiality, but you can see the different ports, right? You've got 2 web services. Oh, and I think we got a little bit of clipping because of the projector. But on the left, we've got 80. On the right, we've got port 443. Down there, we've got DNS 53. And so within one view, you can take that exact same data, and now you can see every service that has port 80 exposed. These ones in the middle are the ones that are hosts that just have 80. The ones that are right are just, 80 and 443. The ones on the right are just those that have 443. And you can quickly understand what systems are what just based off of what they're exposing. And that took, nmap scan to this takes about 30 seconds when you've got the platform up. So this is, I think, going to be incredibly useful as we as attackers are trying to understand the environment. And hopefully you as defenders are trying to understand your environment to protect against these types of kill chains. Currently where I'm at is, I don't know if you guys have seen this XKCD comic, right? But like my idea of what things are going to be and how long they're going to take is oftentimes, like I'm going to automate this stuff and then my life's going to be super easy. I can just automate it away. And like that's not usually the reality. So we've got a little ways to go with this. I'm happy to, if you guys are on the offensive side or defensive side and want to start having conversations about how we can use this stuff better, I would love to have conversations with you. I think the more people and the more data points we consider as we're building our models, the more useful it will be to everybody. And really my end goal as an attacker is to build a model that you as defenders can also use for things like IR investigation and threat hunting. So I think where I think I can go, or we should go next, I've talked about a lot of it, probably, I say after lunch, but really lunch is pretty close. I think next, like I said, is more collaboration on what our data points should be, but not only data points, but the relationships between them. I know I keep saying that over and over and over, because I think if you take anything away, it's that the relationship between data matters. And if we, as defenders, are going to successfully succeed against attackers, that's really where we should go next. And then I think starting to build collaborative tools. There's a lot of really neat libraries out there for analyzing stuff like this, but not a lot of them are built for this type of purpose. So I think as a community, moving more towards tools that help us to analyze these and tools that are open will go a long way. Oh, and I forgot I put it in the slide. Use more data visualization. Yeah, so that's it. Thoughts or questions? Anybody? How much of it is on GitHub? Right now, not any of it because it's super early. Like I said, I'll plan to post the model, and I'm hoping we will be able to do that. Like I say, I would love to say that in a couple months we'll have a beta for everybody. Knowing that XKCD graph, I'm not sure if I want to promise that in front of this many people, but that's, we'll see. Cool. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to come up and talk to me afterwards. But thank you. Oh, yes, sir.
Everybody's doing stuff on GitHub. Microsoft's talking about buying GitHub.
Microsoft bought GitHub. Yes. Yeah. So. Yep. I'd love to talk to you guys about that. For everybody else, thank you guys for coming. Have a good lunch.